Hey folks, in this video I'm going to go over everything that you need to know about Valyira builds in Season 2 of Midnight, be it her role, her curios, her poisons, which is a new thing that she now has, and then also the corrosive powers, which technically is not a Delve-specific thing, but does have a lot of implications for Delves. Now, as I discuss in my main channel video, if you haven't seen that yet, goes over all the gearing for Delves, you can find the link to that in the description. For combat curios, it's just very straightforward. Generally speaking, you're always going to want to run Corrosive Bilespear. Essence Trap is completely garbage, never run this. There is some argument to be made in favor of Orb or Curse, just because this gives you some primary stat and tertiary whenever this procs, but you don't really want to have this happen. You're not really going to be able to, in the vast majority of cases, get much value out of this. And unlike some other curios that have this effect, there's usually one of these every season. Mini Cheat Death give you some bonus. This one doesn't really help you survive. Like, yes, you get Leech, but that doesn't really meaningfully increase your survivability. And sure, they're horrified, but a lot of mobs won't be able to get horrified, and you will just die. One of the best things about the Cheat Death Curio last season is that it gave you a gigantic Absorb Shield, and that it also made mobs take increased damage. So that benefited all other damage sources hitting them. It didn't just give you a bit of primary stat. And it also helped you stay alive if there were really nasty dots ticking away at you. This doesn't do that. I have just found this to be, generally speaking, pretty useless, and Corrosive Bilespear does solid damage. It's the standard Azta'rec type proc curio that we've had many seasons, and it's decent. It's not amazing, you're not going to love it, it's not as good as Mandate was last season, but it's fine. So I've been using this in all scenarios, and I think you should do the same. Now, for utility curios, there's only two that we really need to talk about. Venom Infusion, I just genuinely don't know what they were thinking. This thing is pure dog shit. It's really bad. Dundun's Favor is what I've been running in the vast majority of cases. This is mostly good early on while you're farming Valyira XP, just because, as I've shown in a separate video, you can walk over a Mislaid Curiosity, immediately get the reward from it. So if you run either Grudge Pit or Ring of Glory, both of those are pretty good, you can farm crazy Valyira XP per hour. Now, this is also still good even if you're just doing regular delves. It does give you some free damage. There's a volatile sprite proc. This does like 1 to 2% of your overall. It's not that good. As far as the good utility curios go, it does some of the lowest damage of any season we've ever seen. The problem is just the other options here aren't that great. So considering this gives you really nice quality of life, even if you are running delves after you've gotten Valyira to level 80, you can still run over Mislaid Curiosities and get the little boons, which, if you don't know, at the very first upgrade in the Delver's Journey track, you get this. So technically speaking, you can look at Dundun's Favor as something that's giving you minor stat increases as you progress through the delve if you take a minor detour. You can also use it to get more of the Snake Charmer's Flutes, which have a small chance to drop from the Mislaid Curiosities. Now, early on in the season, you'll usually want to run Purging the Vaults as a way to get all of your Delver's Bounties, but this is the traditional way to get a guaranteed Delver's Bounty, and eventually you'll probably have a lot of these stockpiled. You can just pop them instead of having to go to get Purging the Vaults every single week, and Dundun's Favor will help you do that. Now, I've been running this in the vast majority of delves. Soul-Cracking Dreamcatcher has two use cases. One, if you are really struggling and you really need some sort of damage increase in regular delves, you can use this. It is not completely useless. You can interrupt certain elite mobs, and it does work on other stuns, crowd controls, right? So if you want to make them take 20% increased damage, it does something. It is still very low power, though. I would say in the vast majority of cases for regular delves, just don't even bother with this. You're not going to notice the difference. However, against the Nemesis delve, Azta'rec, this is what you should be running, because he has an interrupt. You will be able to interrupt him regularly enough where this debuff has a very high uptime. I will say I've done some testing on this, and there appears to be an internal cooldown. If I do the first interrupt, I get the full duration. The second interrupt is like half duration, and then the third interrupt just doesn't proc the Dreamcatcher. And then interrupt number 4 goes back to 25 seconds. So I don't really know exactly what's going on there, but it still works enough to where it is just better than Dundun's Favor for the Nemesis Boss, because, Dundun's Favor does basically nothing on the Nemesis Boss. Is it amazing? Is it Mandate levels? No, but it is going to be your best utility curio in those scenarios. Poisons, similarly, are very straightforward. The main thing that you want to keep in mind is that you should always run a poison that affects an enemy. So there are a lot of things that we'll discuss with corrosive powers that either work when you are poisoned or when an enemy is poisoned. But stuff like Sulfur's Venom, this just buffs you. It says it applies it to your weapons, but it doesn't actually count as you yourself having a poison on you, at least as far as I last checked. Maybe they've changed this, but because of that, this doesn't actually give you any special synergy, which means that you just want to use the ones that poison the enemy, because then they also give you other benefits with the corrosive powers we'll talk about in a second. But that's just one kind of icing on the cake factor. Really, the two best poisons, and it's not even close, are these two, which also happen to work on enemies. So Bursting Toad Toxin is what you'll want to run in the vast majority of cases, because it does damage. It's that straightforward. Like, this one does damage to enemies, the other ones don't. I'll read this one. Makes the cast and attack speed of enemies slower. Garbage. This one will fear enemies. Completely garbage. This gives you a stacking damage amp until you take damage, which happens like all the time in Delves. So again, completely garbage. And while this one gives you tertiary stats, it's like so minor. It doesn't have any downside, but why would you run this when you could just run the thing that does more damage? It's really that straightforward. The only reason you'd consider running Blood Cryptoxin, and I would say for the Nemesis Boss for Azta'rec, this is the build that you want to go on basically any roll, no matter what you're doing. Just because, yeah, the Nemesis Boss hurts, and the Bursting Toad Toxin damage is not going to meaningfully change your ability to kill the boss, so this will meaningfully increase your survivability, 10% reduced damage and 10% haste, so it'll slow the cast time. Sure, it's pretty good. This is the best build that you're going to want to run. There's really not a lot of variety this season as far as Curios are concerned, but I will at least touch upon rolls. While this is generally a lot more straightforward than people seem to make it out, I often get comments asking about this. So specifically, I'll start with the Nemesis Boss just because it's the easiest. If you are a tank or a DPS, you're running Healer Valyira for the Nemesis Boss. While you are fighting Azta'rec, Valyira is just severely nerfed. I don't know why. They did this with Nullius 2. She does a fraction of her normal damage in other delves, which means that any extra damage that you can normally get out of Valyira is meaningless when fighting the Nemesis Boss. Your personal damage is the only thing that really matters. And while technically speaking, I believe DPS Valyira will do about 30k and Healer Valyira does 10k, both of those numbers are extremely trivial. However, Healer Valyira will drop the orbs that help you stay alive. And in the vast majority of cases when I have tested the Nemesis Boss on the PTR, it's just a lot better to have infinite survivability, because those healing orbs are really nice. They do make a meaningful difference in your ability to live the auto attacks, and if you get hit by like a wave, if you're a tank, you can live that if you eat a quick Valyira orb. So I find it to just be a lot better to run her as healer. The only reason you'd ever run her as damage is if you were really, really struggling to meet the damage check on the Nemesis Boss's ad, because if you don't kill that fast enough, then you'll start having 2 kicks out at once, and that gets really nasty. At that point, though, realistically speaking, you should just take a break and go farm more gear, and then come back when you can actually make that damage check on your own. Generally speaking, it's just better to run her as healer in all of those cases. Now, if you are playing a healer, which is a very viable strategy for doing Azta'rec, then you can kind of run her on either DPS or tank. I have tested both. I'm honestly not sure which is better. On one hand, having her as a tank will do slightly less damage, and it'll mean that you need to personally contribute more. But if you are playing a healer spec that is able to contribute more, like Disc Priest, where you can actually contribute a lot as Void Weaver Disc while also passively healing Valyira and giving her a slight damage boost, though, like I said, that doesn't mean too much, then you can actually kill the Nemesis Boss at a reasonably efficient rate, and usually you will have enough damage to kill the ad. Now, something to keep in mind is if you're running Valyira as DPS, she generates significantly less threat. And while she's usually a little bit easier to keep alive, if you try to do too much damage on your own, you will rip threat, and then the boss will start pummeling you in the face, which is really bad. So it is easier for healers that don't like doing damage, but for healers who do like doing damage, it can actually be really hard to resist the urge to, like, tip the scales fire breath, as I have done many times, and then, oh, whoops, you have threat. So I'm honestly not sure which one would be better. It kind of depends on the player, but you should probably try this out for yourself and see which of the roles you prefer. But again, the Curios are exactly the same for both. It's just a question of which style of healing you prefer. And for tanks and DPS, again, you always run healer. Now that covers Azta'rec, but as far as builds go for regular Delve running, it's a little bit similar, though there are some key differences. I would say the biggest difference is that tanks should pretty much always run damage dealer Valyira. If you know what you're doing as a tank, you should really never be in a position where you need the healing from Valyira. Early on in the season, maybe if you're slightly under-geared, it can't hurt, but While she is heavily nerfed on the Nemesis Delve, so in that case it doesn't matter, damage Valyira actually does quite a lot in standard Delve running, so this will make things significantly faster. Technically speaking, if you are a DPS player, damage Valyira is also your best option. One key takeaway here is you should never run tank Valyira as a DPS or a tank yourself. I have seen some people say they've tried it, and if you have enough off healing, you can make it work, but I generally think these people are just overcomplicating it. I've done enough delves at this point on countless different alts to find that if I am doing enough damage on my character, it's usually just better to run healer Valyira as a DPS, or if I'm maybe struggling a little bit, I'm a bit low item level, then even if I am a DPS spec, I'll run damage dealer Valyira, and then I'll just try to kite as she cleans up most of the enemies for me. And because she's not a tank, you don't need to pocket heal her, and she'll just be able to kill everything and survive pretty well all on her own. Now, it's a little bit trickier when we discuss healers. And the funny thing about healers is I actually think right now, healing delves is the fastest way to complete them in the vast majority of cases. You can technically speedrun lower level delves as a tank, which has always been the case, and especially in War Within, this was usually the best option, running as a tank with DPS Bran. But Valyira is so much stronger than Bran, and a lot of these delves can hit much harder than the vast majority of stuff in War Within, to the point where running as a healer ends up making things really easy. I don't know exactly what's happening on the back end, but you can very clearly see if you do some runs and compare the numbers side by side, Valyira does significantly more damage, regardless of role, if you yourself are spec'd into healing. So even if you are running the exact same setup, the exact same level, damage dealer Valyira, as a healer spec and a DPS spec, she does about twice as much damage if you are healing. And I assume this is some weird back-end scaling to compensate for the fact that healers generally don't do as much damage, but the amount that she gains tends to outweigh how much damage you would actually contribute as a tank or a DPS. And because Valyira will just survive everything, whereas a lot of mobs in delves, due to scaling issues, will one-shot you, this is usually just a much more consistent way to do higher tier delves, like tier 11. And to top it off, if you're playing a spec like Voidweaver Disc or like Preservation Evoker, which can do substantial damage on its own, then you can actually contribute a fair amount even with Valyira scaling very aggressively. So this makes delves go by extremely quickly. The only thing that you need to decide on, and I really don't have a correct answer here for you, is once again, do you run damage dealer Valyira while you're healing, or tank Valyira? Now, back in Season 1 of Midnight, there was something really wrong with tank Valyira scaling, and she just took way too much damage. She would often die basically instantly, and the way that her damage scaled when you healed her did not work properly. I don't know what was causing it, but Blizzard has apparently fixed that bug, because now I've tested it, and tank Valyira is quite strong. I don't necessarily think she's better than DPS Valyira. The raw damage numbers, if you look at the meters, are similar. DPS Valyira pulls ahead ever so slightly. Tank Valyira, if you are actually pocketing her and getting the damage buff, where when you heal her, she does more damage, she does contribute quite a lot. But the biggest thing with DPS Valyira is that on non-boss enemies, when they drop below 30% health, she instantly kills them. And this won't show up in meters, but it will make the delves considerably faster. So generally speaking, if you can play around it, DPS Valyira is much faster for clearing delves. The only reason why I wouldn't necessarily say you should do this is because if you are running DPS Valyira, she will generate much less threat. And while on Azta'rec, that's fine, you can kind of just sit there for 15 minutes while she solos the entire boss for you, in actual delves, you want to be doing some damage, you want to be contributing to the speed of the delve. That is what makes certain healers so good at clearing delves. And I have managed to do this, but I have a lot more practice. It can be a little bit tricky. You'll have to kite very aggressively because the mobs will be chasing you. So generally speaking, you have to keep a close eye on your own survivability. Often if I'm a priest, I will regularly just run into a mob pack and pain set myself, and I'll be taking a bunch of autos, but I can live it, and then I quickly burst heal myself up as I group up all the mobs and let Valyira AoE it down. And I've gotten enough practice to where this can be a very effective strategy, but I'll be honest, it is just a whole lot simpler to run Valyira as a tank, have her round up all the mobs, and then just pocket heal her as she does most of the work. Is it going to be quite as fast? Maybe not, but it is very chill. I think that is one major advantage of playing as a healer spec in Delves, though. You have two viable builds, one for extremely aggressive speedrunning, and this might be the first time that I can remember where healers are one of the best options you can pick for some sort of solo world content, or you can just take the super cozy chill route and let Tank Valyira do all the work. Either way, I do think it is a good option, and again, only run tank Valyira if you can pocket heal her, because she will actually take substantial damage from the mobs, though in my experience, after the fixes that they gave to her this season, the damage in tank is not spiky enough to where most people should be able to keep her alive if they're just half paying attention. Now that's it for Valyira. We've discussed basically everything that we need to know. Corrosive gifts, there is a little more nuance here. So, I generally speaking recommend using Ophidian Maw in almost every scenario. There are situations where you won't want to do this, we'll talk about this, but as far as damage is concerned, this is really good. In regular delves, not the Nemesis boss, this is always going to be your best option. Ophidian Maw will do a lot of damage to enemies in an area. The damage is split, but any poisoned non-boss creature is executed. And that is really important. If they are poisoned, right, we already have the Valyira poisons that apply to enemies, this will basically always execute mobs below 20% health. So if you look at your damage breakdown, sometimes you will see Ophidian Maw might be doing slightly less damage than other effects, but it's not counting the insta-kill that happens once a mob drops below 20%, and in the vast majority of cases, that damage will outweigh anything else that you're going to get from these gifts. So for standard delves, always run Ophidian Maw. It's a no-brainer. For the Nemesis boss, I still recommend Ophidian Maw because it does really good damage, and it does work on the ad, so that shaves off 20% of the ad's health that you don't need to worry about. Now, for my testing, the other two best damage options, largely for pure single target, are Accursed Poison and Ultec's Gift. Now, Ultec's Gift gains additional power while you yourself are poisoned, and the best way to do this is if you're running Insidious Venom. This will lower some of your stats, but then greatly increase your strength. So whenever this proc is active, then your Ultec's Gift is doing more damage. The thing is, obviously, this one is a little bit less powerful. Generally, you're going to get less value out of the stats than you will just out of a second damage proc. So the combined total damage contribution from running Insidious Venom and Ultec's Gift is usually just worse than running Ultec's Gift plus X. So I wouldn't really worry about that too much, but it is worth acknowledging. And then Accursed Poison is kind of similar. It applies a very long-lasting poison for 1 minute on a target. It does a lot of damage, but it will remove itself if the afflicted target would cast an interruptible spell. Now, from what I've seen, this usually triggers about halfway through the spell cast. So in some cases, let's say you're running DPS or tank Valyira, she will usually instantly kick the enemy, say Azta'rec, and that will stop the cast before Accursed Poison goes off. But if you're playing a DPS or a tank, then the vast majority of the time, unless you have godlike reflexes, you're going to get the kick right around the time when Accursed Poison triggers to stop the cast itself. And while this is really nice, as a way of if you forget to interrupt, then you don't instantly die, it will lose you some damage. So I generally do like this because if you min-max it perfectly, it can do heavy damage. But if you forget to min-max it perfectly, then it's still covering a kick that you may have forgotten. And I cannot count the amount of times that on all of these different Nemesis bosses that have a one-shot kick, I get down to 10%, I'm hyper-fixated on one mechanic, I forget to look at the cast bar, it goes off, I wipe. If I had Accursed Poison during those times, I would have been very happy. So I think, personally, I'm actually going to be running Accursed Poison and Ophidian Maw when I do this on live servers, but if you want to run Accursed Poison, Ultec's Gift, something like that, honestly, I think either one is fine. Now, before I talk about some of the other ones that I think have niche use cases, I will say that Miasma Geyser, Gorgonian Gaze, and Mephitic Cloud I think are just generally completely trash. Mephitic Cloud will drop a, as the name implies, cloud on the ground, and as you stand in it, you will get a debuff that applies a poison to an enemy, and then also causes you to receive slight healing if an enemy is sitting inside of the poison. So the idea of this is it's a hybrid between damage and healing, but it doesn't really do either one particularly well, so I just don't think it's ever worth using. Also, it is worth noting that because you have to stand inside of the cloud to get this benefit, and on Azta'rec there's so much stuff happening, you can never really stand in one place at the same time, it's just never realistically possible to get the maximum value out of this. Similarly, Miasma Geyser does less damage than all the other Curios, and requires the enemy to be inside of the thing when it explodes. So it's just bad, for the same reason that Mephitic Cloud is bad, and Gorgonian Gaze is interesting. It's kind of like that other Curio, the little cheat death Curio when you drop below 50%, but it's just really bad. Obviously, this does nothing on the Nemesis boss, it's completely worthless, and the fact that it makes the enemies invulnerable is actually a downside in many cases, because sure, if you drop low, you want the enemies to not be able to attack you or to have a harder time killing you for a brief period of time, but you would also love to use that opportunity to kill them off, because if the enemies are dead, they can't kill you. And that's what usually most of the other Curios that we have that are cheat death Curios do, and this Corrosive Power does the opposite of that. The enemies can't kill you, but you can't kill them. It's just bad. Now, with that being said, every other curio, I think, has some use case. The best ones that remain would be Ouroboros Cycle, Plague of Corrosion, and Virulent Mucus. Plague of Corrosion is just a solid damage power, really nothing crazy here. I don't think it's ever worth using this on the Nemesis Boss, because that's primarily single target. I also don't really think this is worth using in Delves. I generally think that the other ones have better utility, but this can do good damage on large targets. How much that matters, I don't know. I never use this, but the damage is not bad, so I figure it's at least worth mentioning here. Ouroboros Cycle, I think, has the most potential use out of the rest of them. This does give you a decent amount of secondaries and primary stat, as you can see here. I do find that often the value of this seems dubious. It's really hard to imagine that you're going to get enough secondaries out of this to meaningfully increase your damage, more than something like running Ultek's Gift or Accursed Poison would give you. This is one of those things where Delves are just not serious enough content to where anybody's going to sit down and sim out the relative damage increases, and there's just so many variables here that it's kind of impossible to say. I think you can use this if you want. It's not bad, but generally speaking, proc damage is king in this type of environment, so I don't really think that there's much reason to run this. But then, Virulent Mucus, this one is really interesting. I'd say this is more of an Azta'rec specific power for healers. Because as you can see here, it's meant to be a damage reduction effect, but it only triggers if you take 5% of your maximum health or more. And the vast majority of auto attacks on random enemies are going to trigger this. So if you walk into a delve with this equipped as a tank or a DPS, really as a healer in regular delves, you're going to take 5 random sources of damage that'll do 5% or more of your maximum health, and then this is going to be completely gone. So the only situation where this is really good is if you're effectively getting 5 cheat deaths out of this effect. And where could you theoretically get 5 cheat deaths? Well, on the Nemesis Boss, where basically everything is a one-shot for squishy healers. So if you really want to have the chance to negate, maybe you miss a kick, you can live that. You miss a memory game, you can live that. You get hit by a wave, you can live that. And since as a healer, you're always running either tank Valyira or DPS Valyira and then letting her tank, you're never going to be taking auto attack damage from Azta'rec. Valyira will always be taking all of the autos, and there isn't any random source of damage that can just hit you out of nowhere in Azta'rec, so pretty much all this does is give you 5 chances to negate avoidable damage on the boss, and there's a lot of it. So in that specific case, I do think it's worth using. Outside of that, don't really think you need to consider it. You can also see that if you deal damage to a poisoned enemy, you have a chance to grant 1 additional layer. You can run either Accursed Poison or Ultek's Gift for this. It doesn't really matter which, it's just whichever one that you either have unlocked or you prefer. Though, if you only have 1 power, obviously just run Virulent Mucus. This is more of just a bonus that you can get extra copies of Cheat Death, though realistically speaking, you'd hope you don't need more than 5 cheat deaths to kill the Nemesis Boss. Kind of feels like overkill, but if you do use this, you can just kind of completely cheese the Nemesis Boss. So, worth mentioning for that, it's not worth using outside of that particular scenario. And then finally, we have Viperine Grasp and Lithic Plumage. Now, Lithic Plumage is the most reliable survivability one, and I have seen some people recommend it as a result because it says you get 75 reduced damage. Wow. But the way that this actually works is kind of like Ignore Pain, if you've played Prot Warrior. Ignore Pain reduces your damage by 90% up to a point. Effectively, it's just an Absorb Shield. Think about this as like a tiny Power Word Shield. And the Power Word Shield will only take 75% of your damage, but it's not a 75% DR. So I have tested this, and I've looked at my healing breakdown after the fact, and it does basically nothing. It is, technically speaking, a tiny amount of survivability, and specifically if you are a squishy DPS that does not have a lot of ways to keep yourself alive, you can run this, but really you should have enough survivability from healer Valyira, so the only reason why I think you'd ever want to run this is if for some reason you were cooking up something crazy where you ran DPS Valyira on Azta'rec, and you needed that extra damage, and then you also needed Lithic Plumage as a way to survive. But then at that point, wouldn't you just gain more damage by running Ultek's Gift and Accursed Poison? I don't know. I've seen enough people advocate for this, and it technically has some use case. It gives you some survivability, unlike the other ones, so I'm mentioning it here, but I don't think it's very good. And now finally, Viperine Grasp. I think people are sleeping on this for regular delves. This does a decent amount of nature damage, and it grips enemies in. Now, the damage on this is not good enough to where you're ever going to want to run it on Azta'rec. Mostly single target, right? So you're always going to run some combination if you want damage of Ophidian Maw, Accursed Poison, or Ultek's Gift. But when I'm farming Delves, I've just been running Ophidian Maw and Viper and Grasp, and this will just gank in mobs like casters that are sitting in the middle of nowhere on top of you, and then Viper and Grasp will proc, and if the casters are low, they get one-shot. So a lot of the Delves that I've historically found to be the most annoying while running this setup, I'm just constantly getting free, basically, death grips, pulling all the mobs on top of me, and then, of course, if I'm running them on my Blood DK, I have Viper and Grasp, I have random death grips, I have Gorfien's Grasp. The mobs are basically just constantly stacked on top of me, which makes them really easy to cleave down, and means that Ophidian Maw is always in range to one-shot them the moment they get to 20% or lower. So even though this does a bit less damage than the other options, such as Plague of Corrosion, Accursed Poison, or Ultec's Gift, the utility of this usually makes the Delves go significantly faster. So if you are looking for a great farming combination, Ophidian Maw, Viper, and Grasp, I think a lot of people are sleeping on this. I have found it to be immensely helpful. But yeah, that covers everything that we need to know about Valyira builds and corrosive powers. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and I hope you have a good time in Season 2.